Deep in the heart of Vatican City, behind walls that have guarded secrets for nearly 2,000 years, lies a collection of clay tablets older than Christianity itself. These aren't just any tablets. They are fragments of humanity's first written words, pressed into wet clay by Sumerian scribes 5,000 years ago, long before Abraham walked the earth or Moses received the Ten Commandments. The Vatican has acknowledged possessing cuneiform artifacts, yet questions persist about what stories remain locked within these ancient inscriptions. Tonight, we journey through the mists of time, from the marshlands of ancient Mesopotamia to the marble halls of the Holy See, to explore one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. What do the Vatican's Sumerian tablets really say? Close your eyes now and let your mind drift backward through the centuries, past the rise and fall of empires, past the birth of nations we know today, past medieval cathedrals and Roman legions and Egyptian pharaohs, until you arrive at a place where civilization itself was just beginning to take shape. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast floodplain where two great rivers snake their way toward the sea. This is Mesopotamia, a name that comes from the ancient Greek meaning the land between the rivers. And those rivers are the Tigris and the Euphrates, flowing through what we now call southern Iraq. Here, in marshlands that stretched endlessly beneath a blazing sun, something extraordinary happened. Humans stopped wandering. They settled. They built. And in doing so, they created the very foundations of the world we inhabit today. The landscape would have been unlike anything you might picture when you think of the Middle East. Yes, there was heat, the kind of heat that shimmers on the horizon and makes the air itself feel thick with warmth. But there was also water everywhere, canals cutting through fields of barley and wheat, date palms swaying gently in whatever breeze managed to stir the heavy air, and vast reed beds where waterbirds called out across the wetlands. Each year, the rivers would swell with snowmelt from mountains far to the north, flooding the plains and depositing rich, dark silt across the land. This annual inundation was both blessing and curse, for it renewed the soil with nutrients that made agriculture possible, but also threatened to destroy everything that had been built. And the people who mastered this landscape, who learned to channel the floods and irrigate the fields, who transformed marshland into one of the most productive agricultural regions the ancient world had ever seen, called themselves the Black-Headed People. We know them as the Sumerians, though this name came much later, and their very existence presents one of history's most enduring mysteries. The Sumerian problem, as scholars call it, began almost as soon as their civilization was rediscovered in the 19th century. After nearly 200 years of archaeological excavation, linguistic analysis, and careful interpretation of ancient texts, debates continue about who these people really were and where they came from. Their language offers no easy answers. Unlike nearly every other ancient tongue, Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, no family of sister languages that might point toward origins or migrations. It stands alone in the vast landscape of human speech, as mysterious as the people who spoke it. When scholars first encountered Sumerian inscriptions, they assumed they must be dealing with a form of Akkadian or some other Semitic language. The discovery that Sumerian was something entirely different something that did not fit into any established category, only deepened the enigma. Recent genetic studies have provided some clues, suggesting that the closest living relatives to the ancient Sumerians are the marsh Arabs who still inhabit southern Iraq today, fishing and farming in the same waterways their ancestors knew 5,000 years ago. But genetics can only tell us so much, and the questions persist. Did the Sumerians migrate from somewhere else, bringing their unique language and culture with them? Or did they develop in place, an indigenous flowering of civilization in the Fertile Crescent? The clay tablets they left behind, thousands upon thousands of them, offer tantalizing glimpses but no definitive answers. What we do know is that the Sumerians built cities, the first true cities in human history: Uruk, Ur, Eridu, Nippur, Kish. Let these names roll through your mind like a quiet incantation, for they represent something genuinely revolutionary. Before these places existed, humans had lived in villages, in scattered settlements where everyone knew everyone, and life followed the rhythms of seasons and harvests. The Sumerian cities were something new. At its height, Uruk may have housed anywhere from 40,000 to 80,000 people, an almost unimaginable concentration of humanity for its time. Such numbers required organization, specialization, hierarchy. Not everyone could be a farmer when so many people lived in close proximity. And so society became complex in ways it had never been before. There were priests who served in the great temples called ziggurats, massive stepped pyramids of mud brick that rose above the flat landscape like artificial mountains, reaching toward the heavens where the gods were thought to dwell. There were scribes who kept the records that made administration possible. There were merchants who traded Sumerian grain and textiles for the timber and stone and metals that the river valley lacked. There were potters and weavers and metalworkers, the craftsmen whose skills were passed down through generations. There were farmers, of course, the backbone of everything, tending the fields and managing the intricate canal systems that made agriculture possible in this land of too much water and too little rain. The wealth of Sumer lay in its magnificently efficient agricultural production. Fields of barley and wheat stretched to the horizon, yielding surpluses that could be stored, traded, and taxed. This abundance freed some portion of the population from the endless labor of food production, allowing them to pursue other endeavors, to become specialists in crafts or commerce, or the service of the gods. The temple stood at the center of everything, not merely as a place of worship, but as an economic engine, collecting offerings, redistributing resources, employing scribes and laborers and artisans. To understand ancient Sumer is to understand that religion and economics were not separate spheres, but intimately intertwined, that the gods owned the land and the people worked it on their behalf, that priests were administrators as much as spiritual guides. In this world of canals and ziggurats, of barley and bronze, something remarkable emerged, something that would change the trajectory of human history more profoundly than any single invention before or since. The human impulse to record, to remember, to communicate across distance and time found its first permanent expression. Writing was born, but it did not spring fully formed from the mind of some ancient genius. Like most revolutionary developments, it evolved gradually, emerging from practical needs rather than artistic or spiritual inspiration. Long before anyone pressed the first wedge-shaped marks into wet clay, people in the ancient Near East had developed systems for keeping track of things. Small clay tokens, shaped into spheres and cones and discs, represented quantities of goods, sheep perhaps, or measures of grain. These tokens date back to the 9th millennium before the Common Era, thousands of years before writing proper emerged. People would use them to count, to record transactions, to keep track of debts and payments. Over time, the system grew more sophisticated. Tokens were placed inside hollow clay balls called bullae, and the shapes of the tokens inside were impressed on the outside surface so that the contents could be known without breaking the seal. This was accounting, pure and simple, the ancient equivalent of spreadsheets and ledgers. The cuneiform script developed from these pictographic beginnings in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The transition happened slowly. At first, scribes drew pictures on clay tablets, vertical columns of images representing the things being counted or described. A picture of a barley stalk meant barley. A picture of a sheep meant sheep. These proto-cuneiform records were overwhelmingly practical. Lists of goods received and distributed, inventories of temple storerooms, accounts of transactions between merchants. The characteristic wedge shape that gives cuneiform its name came later, as scribes discovered that pressing a reed stylus into wet clay at an angle was faster and more efficient than trying to draw curved lines. The pictures became stylized, abstracted, until they no longer resembled the objects they originally depicted. A sign that once looked like a star became a pattern of wedges that represented the concept of divinity. A sign that once looked like a head became a cluster of marks that could mean head or person or capital. The pictographs lost their original function, and individual signs could carry multiple meanings depending on context. This was the true revolution, the moment when writing broke free from simple picture-making and became capable of recording not just nouns, but verbs, not just objects, but ideas, not just inventories, but stories. The sign inventory was eventually reduced from some 1,500 symbols to around 600, and writing became increasingly phonological, meaning that signs could represent sounds rather than just things. A skilled scribe could now write anything that could be spoken, could capture the full richness of human language in patterns of wedges pressed into clay. But becoming a skilled scribe was no simple matter. Training took years, beginning in childhood and continuing through adolescence and beyond. Schools called tablet houses have been excavated throughout Mesopotamia, their floors littered with the practice tablets of ancient students, young people laboriously copying lists of signs and words, making mistakes that were corrected by teachers, slowly building the fluency that would allow them to serve in temples or palaces or merchant houses. The physical process of writing was itself an art. You would take a lump of clay, knead it until it reached the right consistency, shape it into a tablet that fit comfortably in one hand. Then, take your reed stylus, cut at an angle to produce the characteristic wedge shape, and begin pressing marks into the soft surface. You had to work quickly before the clay dried, but carefully, because mistakes were difficult to correct. When the tablet was complete, it could be left to dry in the sun, remaining fragile but readable, or it could be fired in a kiln, becoming hard and durable, capable of surviving for thousands of years. Ironically, many of the tablets that have come down to us were preserved by catastrophe. When buildings burned, whether by accident or during the sack of cities by conquering armies, the clay tablets inside were fired by the flames, transformed from fragile records into nearly indestructible artifacts. The very destruction that ended ancient libraries also preserved them for posterity. Some tablets were important enough to warrant extra protection. Private or confidential documents were sometimes sealed inside clay envelopes, outer layers of clay inscribed with summaries of the contents or the names of witnesses, ancient precursors to the sealed letters of later centuries. The script that began in Sumer did not stay there. Cuneiform proved remarkably adaptable, capable of being modified to write languages entirely unrelated to Sumerian. When Akkadian speakers rose to prominence in Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium before the Common Era, they adapted cuneiform to their Semitic tongue. Later still, the script was used for Babylonian and Assyrian, for Amorite and Aramaic, even for Hittite, an Indo-European language spoken in ancient Turkey, and for Hurrian, as a language so unusual that scholars still struggle to classify it. For more than 3,000 years, cuneiform served as the dominant writing system across a vast swath of the ancient world, from the Mediterranean coast to the Iranian plateau, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. This means of communicating was used for over 3 millennia in 15 different languages, a testament to its flexibility and power. The last cuneiform tablet that can be firmly dated comes from the city of Uruk, the same place where the script first emerged, and dates to 79 or 80 of the Common Era, a time when the Roman Empire was at its height and Christianity was spreading through the Mediterranean world. By then, cuneiform had been largely replaced by alphabetic scripts, easier to learn, though perhaps less beautiful in their complexity. But for those 3,000 years, it was cuneiform that carried the written word across the ancient Near East. And what did they write? What words were considered important enough to press into clay and preserve for the ages? The answer is everything. Everything that mattered to the people who made these records, which turns out to be a remarkably broad range of human experience. There were business contracts and receipts, records of loans and sales and rentals that give us intimate glimpses into the economic lives of ordinary people. There were letters, from kings to their generals, from merchants to their partners, from wives to absent husbands, full of the concerns and complaints and affections that make ancient people seem suddenly, startlingly human. There were legal codes, most famously the laws of Hammurabi, attempting to bring order and justice to complex societies. There were astronomical observations, tracking the movements of stars and planets with impressive precision, laying the groundwork for later developments in mathematics and science. There were medical texts recording symptoms and treatments, prayers to be recited over the sick, lists of healing herbs and their uses. There were school texts, the exercises of students learning their craft, which inadvertently preserved everything from grammatical rules to collections of proverbs. There were hymns to the gods, praise songs, and laments and prayers that give us access to the spiritual lives of ancient believers. There were fables and wisdom literature, stories with morals that would not seem out of place in later traditions. There were epic poems that celebrated heroes and explored the deepest questions of human existence. The ancient Sumerians seemed determined to record every aspect of their history, from the lineage of their leaders and the outcomes of ancient battles to the rise and fall of kingdoms and even disputes between citizens and businesses. From mundane receipts for the delivery of sheep to cosmic myths about the creation of the universe, the clay tablets preserve it all. And what stories did they tell? What visions of the cosmos, of gods and humans, did they press into the waiting clay? Among their greatest works is a creation epic that would echo through the ages, finding strange resonance with stories written centuries later in lands far to the west. The text is called Enuma Elish, which simply means "when on high." The opening words of the poem, in the same way that the Hebrew book of Genesis is sometimes called Bereshit, meaning "in the beginning," after its first word. The Enuma Elish is the most complete surviving account of ancient Near Eastern cosmology, a vast poem of approximately 1,000 lines, recorded on 7 clay tablets in the Akkadian language, using Sumero-Akkadian cuneiform script. It dates from the late 2nd millennium before the Common Era, though it certainly drew on much older traditions, and it was discovered in fragmentary form by the English archaeologist Austen Henry Layard in 1849 amid the ruins of the Great Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh. Each of the 7 tablets held between 115 and 170 lines of text, and though most of Tablet 5 has never been recovered, the remainder of the poem is remarkably complete, allowing us to follow the narrative from beginning to end. The story begins before the beginning, in a time when nothing yet existed except 2 primordial beings, Apsu and Tiamat, representing the fresh waters and the salt waters respectively. From their mingling came the first generation of gods, and from those gods came more gods, each generation noisier and more troublesome than the last. Apsu, disturbed by the clamour of his descendants, determined to destroy them. But the clever god Ea discovered the plot and killed Apsu first. From this primal conflict emerged further tensions, as Tiamat, grieving and angry, assembled an army of monsters to avenge her consort and destroy the younger gods. The divine assembly trembled in fear, for none among them seemed powerful enough to face Tiamat and her terrible forces. Then stepped forward Marduk, a young god of the latest generation, who offered to fight the dragon goddess on one condition. If he won, he would be made supreme ruler over all the gods. The assembly agreed, and Marduk went forth to battle. Armed with winds and storms, with net and mace and bow, he confronted Tiamat in her terrible glory. He caught her in his net, filled her with the raging winds so that she could not close her mouth, then shot an arrow through her heart. From her corpse he fashioned the world, splitting her body like a shellfish, setting half above as the sky and half below as the earth. From the blood of Kingu, her captured general, mixed with clay, he created humanity to serve the gods and free them from labor. This is why humans exist, the story teaches, to be servants of the divine, to build temples and offer sacrifices, to maintain the cosmic order that Marduk established. The parallels between the Enuma Elish and the biblical book of Genesis have fascinated and troubled scholars since cuneiform was first deciphered. Both texts begin with temporal clauses that establish a primordial starting point, when on high in Akkadian, in the beginning in Hebrew. Both describe a watery chaos existing before creation, a formless darkness from which ordered reality emerges. The Hebrew word for the deep, tehom, is linguistically related to the name Tiamat, suggesting some connection between the Babylonian dragon goddess and the waters over which the Spirit of God moves in Genesis. Both accounts describe a separation of the primordial waters into upper and lower waters, and the creation of a firmament or dome to hold back the celestial ocean. Both include the creation of humanity from earthly materials and divine elements, dust and the breath of God in Genesis, clay and the blood of a god in the Enuma Elish. The numerical correspondence is striking as well. The Enuma Elish is recorded on 7 tablets, and the Genesis account describes creation taking place over 7 days. Scholars have proposed various explanations for these similarities. Some argue that biblical writers knew the Enuma Elish directly, perhaps encountering it during the Babylonian captivity in the 6th century before the Common Era, and deliberately reworked it to express their monotheistic theology. Others suggest that both texts drew on common traditions shared across the ancient Near East, that the stories of creation from chaos were part of a cultural inheritance that extended far beyond any single civilization. A third possibility is that there was a common ancestor, some older tradition now lost that gave rise to both the Mesopotamian and Hebrew versions. Yet the differences are equally significant. The Enuma Elish is thoroughly polytheistic, a tale of divine conflict and generation, of gods plotting against gods, of cosmic warfare that shapes the universe. Genesis presents a single God who creates by fiat, by the power of speech alone, with no conflict, no resistance, no opponent to overcome. In the Babylonian myth, matter is eternal, pre-existing the gods who merely organize it into new forms. In the Hebrew account, God creates from nothing, speaks light and darkness into being, where before there was only the void. The Enuma Elish culminates in the establishment of Marduk's temple at Babylon and the god's celebration of his victory. Genesis moves toward the Sabbath rest, the 7th day when God ceases from labor and sanctifies time itself. These are not the same story, but they share enough that we cannot ignore the connections, cannot pretend that biblical narrative emerged in isolation from the broader culture of the ancient Near East. The Enuma Elish was not the only Mesopotamian text to find echoes in the Hebrew Bible. Perhaps even more striking are the parallels between the Epic of Gilgamesh and the story of Noah's flood. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, seeking immortality after the death of his friend Enkidu, journeys to find Utnapishtim, the one human who was granted eternal life by the gods. And Utnapishtim tells him how he came to possess this gift. The gods, disturbed by the noise of humanity, decided to destroy all life with a great flood. But Ea, the god of wisdom, warned Utnapishtim in a dream, instructing him to build a boat and to take aboard the seed of all living things. Utnapishtim obeyed, constructing a vessel, loading it with his family and representatives of every species, and sealing himself inside as the rains began. For 6 days and 7 nights, the storm raged, and all flesh that was on the land perished. When the waters receded, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven, to see if dry land had appeared. When the raven did not return, he knew the flood had ended. He offered sacrifice, and the gods gathered like flies around the offering, and Enlil, who had decreed the destruction, was persuaded to grant Utnapishtim immortality. The similarities to the biblical flood narrative are unmistakable. Divine displeasure leading to destruction, one righteous man warned to build a boat, the gathering of animals, the duration of the flood, the mountain landing, the birds sent out, the sacrifice offered afterward. When George Smith first translated the Flood Tablet in 1872, his discovery made front-page news across Europe. Here was a story older than the Bible telling essentially the same tale. For a Victorian world that had considered Scripture the oldest text in existence, the original account of human history, this was a profound shock. In the mid-19th century, European museums and academic and religious institutions had sponsored excavations in Mesopotamia, hoping to find physical evidence confirming the stories of the Bible. Instead, they found something far more complicated. Evidence that many biblical narratives had Mesopotamian predecessors, that the sacred stories of Judaism and Christianity were part of a broader cultural inheritance, shaped by and shared with civilizations that worshipped entirely different gods. These discoveries, tablets emerging from the Iraqi soil that told stories older than the Bible, sent shockwaves through the scholarly and religious world of the 19th century. And it was in this climate of revelation and anxiety that institutions began to collect these ancient treasures, to study them, to grapple with what they meant for received truths and established faiths. Among those institutions was the Vatican, the ancient seat of the Roman Catholic Church, guardian of traditions stretching back 2,000 years, now confronted with texts stretching back even further to the very dawn of human civilization. Within the ancient walls of Vatican City, there exists a place that has captured the imagination of historians and conspiracy theorists alike for centuries, a repository of documents and artifacts that stretches back through the corridors of time to the very foundations of the Catholic Church and beyond. And to understand what the Vatican might possess from the ancient world of Mesopotamia, we must first understand the nature of this remarkable institution and dispel some of the myths that have grown around it, like ivy on old stone. The Vatican Apostolic Archive, known until recently by a far more evocative name, has long been shrouded in an aura of mystery that owes more to linguistic confusion than to any genuine attempt at concealment. For when people hear the phrase secret archive, they naturally imagine locked vaults filled with forbidden knowledge, documents that would shake the foundations of faith if ever they saw the light of day. Yet the truth is considerably more mundane, though no less fascinating. The Latin word secretum, from which the former name derived, does not carry the modern English connotation of hidden or confidential. Rather, it stems from the verb secernere, meaning to separate or to distinguish or to set apart. And in this context, it simply indicated that the archive was separated from other collections and reserved for the personal use of the Pope and those officials he appointed to manage it. Pope Paul V established this archive in the early 17th century, creating a distinction between these documents and those housed in the Vatican Library. And for centuries, this separation was maintained with varying degrees of access, granted to outside scholars depending on the inclinations of each successive pontiff. It was not until 2019 that Pope Francis issued an apostolic letter officially changing the name from the Vatican Secret Archive to the Vatican Apostolic Archive. A decision that acknowledged how the old name had become a source of endless speculation and misunderstanding in the popular imagination. The physical reality of this archive is staggering in its scope, for within its walls and beneath its floors there rest approximately 53 miles of shelving, 35,000 volumes of catalogue, and documents spanning more than 12 centuries of continuous history. And when one considers that the Catholic Church has been a major actor on the world stage for nearly 2,000 years, the magnitude of this accumulation becomes easier to comprehend. The archive contains state papers and diplomatic correspondence, and account books and personal letters and legal documents and ecclesiastical records of every conceivable variety. Each page representing a moment frozen in time when someone somewhere deemed it important enough to commit to writing and preserve for posterity. In 1980, an underground bunker was constructed to house additional materials, a climate-controlled environment designed to protect fragile documents from the ravages of temperature and humidity that have already claimed so many treasures of the ancient world. And this expansion speaks to the ongoing accumulation of materials that continues even today. Yet, for all its vastness, the Vatican Apostolic Archive was not always open to scholars. Indeed, for most of its existence, it remained firmly closed to outside researchers, and it was only in the late 19th century that Pope Leo XIII took the revolutionary step of opening portions of the collection to qualified academics, a decision that transformed our understanding of medieval and early modern history in countless ways. Today, more than 1,000 researchers each year make the journey to Vatican City seeking access to these documents. Though the process of gaining entry remains deliberately rigorous and designed to ensure that only serious scholars with legitimate research purposes are admitted. The requirements begin with a letter of recommendation from an established scholar at a recognized research institution, and this must be accompanied by an application form submitted well in advance that specifies precisely what materials the researcher wishes to examine and during what time period they intend to conduct their work. Following the successful submission of these materials, the prospective researcher must then undergo a short interview conducted entirely in Italian, a requirement that serves both as a test of dedication and as a practical measure, since many of the documents and finding aids are written in that language or in Latin. Even after a researcher has successfully navigated these hurdles and received their letter of invitation, the restrictions do not end. For once inside the archive, no browsing is permitted, and scholars must work only with the specific materials they have previously identified and requested. This is not an institution where one can wander the stacks pulling volumes at random in search of serendipitous discoveries. Rather, it demands that researchers arrive with a clear plan and the knowledge necessary to execute it efficiently, and those who attempt to deviate from their stated purpose will find themselves politely but firmly redirected. The documents that have emerged from this archive over the past century and a half have reshaped our understanding of countless historical events and personalities, from the trial records of Galileo to the excommunication of Martin Luther, to diplomatic correspondence that illuminates the political machinations of Renaissance Europe. Among the most dramatic holdings is the 1521 papal bull that formally severed Martin Luther from the Catholic Church, a document that represents one of the pivotal moments in Western religious history, when the unity of Christendom was fractured in ways that continue to reverberate through our world today. Another treasure is a letter written by Mary, Queen of Scots, while awaiting her execution, a poignant personal document from a woman who has become one of history's most romanticized tragic figures, her words preserved across the centuries on paper that once rested in her own hands. Perhaps most remarkable is the chignon parchment, a document the size of a dining room table that records the trials of the Knights Templar in the early 14th century. Trials that would lead to the dissolution of that legendary military order and the execution of many of its members on charges of blasphemy and heresy. This parchment was lost for centuries within the archive itself, a victim of misfiling that left it languishing in a box of miscellaneous documents until its rediscovery in 2001 demonstrated that even the Vatican's own archivists do not always know the full extent of what lies within their care. The oldest loose parchment in the entire collection dates from 809 of the Common Era and documents a donation made to a church in Venice. A fragile piece of animal skin that has somehow survived 1,200 years of history through fire and flood and war and the simple passage of time. Yet, despite the genuine openness that has characterized the archive since Leo XIII, there remain restrictions that continue to fuel speculation about what might still be hidden from view. For the Vatican maintains a policy of keeping certain categories of documents closed to researchers regardless of their credentials or intentions. Everything dated after 1958 remains off-limits to scholars, as do the private records of church figures after 1922. Restrictions that primarily relate to contemporary personalities and events rather than to ancient secrets. This policy follows a practice established in 1924, whereby the Pope grants access to documents grouped by pontificate, with the boundary gradually moving forward as time creates sufficient distance from living persons and sensitive situations. And currently this boundary extends to the end of the papacy of Pius XII in October 1958. The rationale for these restrictions is straightforward and mirrors the practices of many government archives around the world for documents relating to living individuals or recent events, may contain information that could cause harm if released prematurely, and institutions have long recognized the need to balance transparency with prudence. But when we speak of ancient Mesopotamian tablets and the earliest written records of human civilization, we must look beyond the apostolic archive. For that institution primarily contains documents of the Church itself, the papal correspondence, and ecclesiastical records that accumulated over centuries of Catholic history. To find artifacts from the ancient Near East, we must venture elsewhere within the walls of Vatican City, past the administrative offices, and through the corridors that lead to one of the world's great museum complexes, the Vatican Museums. Within this sprawling collection of art and artifacts gathered by popes across the centuries, there exists a section dedicated to the ancient world of Egypt and Mesopotamia, and it is here that we find the physical evidence of the Vatican's connection to the earliest chapters of human literacy. The Gregorian Egyptian Museum was founded in 1839 on the initiative of Pope Gregory XVI, occupying 9 rooms that open onto a broad hemicycle with views to the terrace of the niche of the pine cone. And within these spaces, visitors can encounter a collection of over 20,000 ancient Egyptian artifacts that ranks among the most important such collections outside of Egypt itself. Mummies and sarcophagi and statues of gods and pharaohs fill these rooms with the weight of millennia, each object a physical link to a civilization that flourished along the Nile thousands of years before the birth of Christ. And the atmosphere within these chambers carries a quality of hushed reverence appropriate to such proximity with the ancient dead. But it is the final 3 rooms of this museum that concern us most directly tonight. For these spaces added to the collection in the 1970s are dedicated to artifacts from the ancient Near East, the region we now know as Iraq and Syria, and Iran and Turkey, where the first cities rose, and the first written words were pressed into wet clay. Here visitors can see reliefs and inscriptions from Assyrian palaces, massive stone panels carved with the elaborate decorative schemes that characterized those powerful kingdoms, winged bulls and hunting scenes, and royal proclamations that once adorned the halls where kings held court and received tribute from conquered peoples. The last room focuses specifically on the northern part of Iraq, the ancient land of the Assyrians, whose empire once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea, and whose scribes maintained vast libraries of cuneiform tablets that preserved knowledge ranging from astronomical observations to medical treatments to literary masterpieces. And yes, there are cuneiform tablets in the Vatican's collection, confirmed by the Vatican Museum's own website, which describes how entire administrative archives and libraries of tablets present us with a lively and direct account of the historic and political events and social and economic organization and mythology and religion of the peoples of Mesopotamia and Western Iran and Turkey and Syria. One specific tablet highlighted in the museum's online collection comes from Nippur and dates to the early Babylonian age during the reign of Rim-Sin of Larsa between 1822 and 1763 before the Common Era. A small object of baked clay measuring just 6.8 centimeters in height and 4.3 centimeters in width and 2.1 centimeters in depth. This tablet comes from the collection of the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome, an institution whose existence speaks to the Vatican's long engagement with the scholarly study of ancient Near Eastern texts and their relationship to biblical narrative. The Pontifical Biblical Institute, known also as the Biblicum, was founded in 1909 by Pope Pius X and entrusted to the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits who have long been renowned for their intellectual rigor and their commitment to education. This institution represents a center for specialized postgraduate study of sacred scripture and related sciences. And, crucially, it houses a faculty of ancient Near Eastern studies that awards academic degrees in ancient Oriental languages, training new generations of scholars in the difficult art of reading cuneiform and other ancient scripts. The library of the Pontifical Biblical Institute began building an Oriental collection in 1932. At the same time, the institution created its second faculty dedicated to the study of the ancient Near East, and this collection has grown to include rare and respected publications related to the Egyptian and Mesopotamian worlds. The Aula Orientalis within this library presently occupies 3 rooms and contains approximately 12,500 volumes on Sumerology and Assyriology and Hittitology and Egyptology, a specialized research collection that supports advanced scholarship in these challenging fields. The Vatican's contribution to cuneiform studies extends beyond mere collection to active participation in the global scholarly enterprise. For the cuneiform bibliography, known as KB, appears annually in print in the journal Orientalia, published by the Pontifical Biblical Institute, providing researchers worldwide with a comprehensive listing of new publications in the field. The Vatican museums have also made their collections available for international collaborative projects, including the Ashurbanipal Library Project, an effort to reconstruct virtually the great library of that ancient Assyrian king, whose passion for collecting texts resulted in one of the most important archaeological discoveries in history. So we can state with confidence that the Vatican does possess cuneiform tablets and actively participates in their study. But this raises the question that lies at the heart of our inquiry tonight. Are there tablets in the Vatican's collection that remain untranslated? And if so, what might they contain? And why have they not been made available to the scholarly world? To answer this question, we must step back and consider a broader truth about the state of cuneiform studies worldwide, a truth that contextualizes whatever the Vatican might or might not possess within a much larger picture of scholarly limitation and archival backlog. The numbers are staggering, and they reveal a discipline overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of its source material. For between 500,000 and 2 million cuneiform tablets are estimated to have been excavated in modern times, and of these, only approximately 30,000 to 100,000 have been fully read or published. Let those figures settle in your mind as you drift towards sleep tonight. Hundreds of thousands of clay tablets pressed with wedge-shaped marks by scribes who lived and died millennia ago. Tablets that contain words in languages spoken by no one for thousands of years. Tablets that sit in museum storage rooms and university collections around the world, waiting for the attention of specialists who may never come. The largest collections dwarf anything the Vatican might possess, with the British Museum holding approximately 130,000 tablets, and the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Louvre in Paris, and the Istanbul Archaeology Museums, and the National Museum of Iraq, and the Yale Babylonian Collection with its 40,000 tablets, and the Penn Museum, all maintaining vast repositories of unstudied material. The reason for this backlog is not conspiracy or suppression, but rather the brutal mathematics of expertise and time. For cuneiform is among the most difficult of all ancient scripts to master, and there are only a few hundred scholars in the entire world qualified to decode these clay tablets filled with wedge-shaped symbols. Each tablet requires careful cleaning and examination, and photography, and drawing, and transliteration, and translation. A process that can take hours or days or weeks, depending on the condition of the tablet and the complexity of its contents. And when you multiply these hours by hundreds of thousands of tablets, you begin to understand why most have lain in collections for a century without being studied. Researchers have acknowledged that translating an ancient language is a time-intensive process, and that the handful of qualified cuneiformists cannot possibly keep pace with the material that has already been excavated, let alone the new discoveries that continue to emerge from archaeological sites across the Middle East. And what would we find if we could suddenly read all these tablets, if we could wave a magic wand and unlock the contents of every clay document in every museum on Earth? The answer may disappoint those hoping for explosive revelations. For the vast majority of cuneiform tablets contain exactly the kind of mundane bureaucratic records that fill archives in every civilization. Studies of existing collections reveal that most tablets contain inscriptions pertaining to the receipt of and payment for goods and services, essentially accounting records tracking the flow of grain and livestock and textiles and labor that kept ancient economies functioning. School exercise tablets are also common, the work of scribes in training who practiced their wedge-shaped marks over and over until they achieved the precision necessary to serve in temple or palace administration. The content of most tablets relates primarily to agriculture, and commerce. Temple records and business documents dating from over 4,000 years ago that tell us about the daily operations of ancient institutions, but offer little in the way of theological or cosmological revelation. This is not to diminish the value of such documents, for they provide invaluable information about how ancient societies actually functioned. But it does suggest that the untranslated tablets in museums worldwide are unlikely to contain the kind of sensational secrets that conspiracy theories imagine. Yet, even as the backlog of untranslated tablets continues to grow, the field stands on the cusp of a revolution, for artificial intelligence has begun to demonstrate remarkable capabilities in deciphering these ancient texts. A team of archaeologists and computer scientists from Israel has created an AI-powered translation program for ancient Akkadian cuneiform that allows tens of thousands of already digitized tablets to be translated into English instantaneously, a development that promises to transform our access to ancient Mesopotamian literature and records. The Cuneiform Translation Project aims to address the significant gap in translating these tablets, recognizing that with over 500,000 untranslated tablets in museums worldwide, there exists an immense reservoir of information about the development of early Western civilization that remains locked within clay. New tools like ProtoSnap allow scholars to analyze broader datasets by automating transcription, uncovering patterns and connections that were previously inaccessible due to the labor-intensive nature of manual translation. And the significance of these AI breakthroughs extends beyond academic research to potentially democratize access to humanity's earliest written heritage. So if the Vatican has cuneiform tablets that remain untranslated, they are far from alone in this situation, for every major museum in the world faces similar backlogs and similar constraints on the specialized expertise required to address them. The real question is not whether there are untranslated tablets in Vatican collections, but rather whether there is any evidence of intentional suppression, any indication that texts have been deliberately kept from scholarly view, because their contents might challenge established religious narratives. And here, the evidence points strongly toward resource constraints rather than conspiracy, toward a global shortage of cuneiformists rather than institutional secrecy, toward the mundane realities of academic funding and specialist training rather than the dramatic cover-ups of popular imagination. But the Vatican Apostolic Archive primarily contains documents of the Church itself, and for ancient Near Eastern artifacts, we must look elsewhere within the walls of the Holy See to the Vatican museums, where the weight of Mesopotamian antiquity sits in climate-controlled rooms, waiting to share its secrets with those who have the patience and expertise to listen. In the dusty heat of the 1840s and 1850s, teams of European archaeologists descended upon the ancient mounds of Mesopotamia, their shovels and pickaxes breaking through millennia of accumulated earth to reveal treasures beyond imagination. And among the most extraordinary discoveries was the Royal Library of Ashurbanipal, the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, a collection of more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments containing texts of all kinds and in various languages from the 7th century before the Common Era. Ashurbanipal was known as a tenacious martial commander, yet he was also a recognized intellectual who was literate and passionately devoted to the preservation of knowledge. And in collecting texts for his library, he wrote to cities and centers of learning across Mesopotamia, instructing them to send him copies of all works written in the region. For as an apprentice scribe, he had mastered both the Akkadian and the Sumerian languages and understood the profound value of these ancient words. The great historian H.G. Wells would later call this library the most precious source of historical material in the world, and indeed among its holdings was the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, a story that would soon shake the foundations of Victorian religious certainty. For you see, prior to the 19th century, the Bible was considered the oldest book in the world, and its narratives were thought to be completely original, sprung fully formed from divine revelation without earthly precedent or parallel. And this belief formed one of the cornerstone assumptions of Western civilization, an unquestioned truth that shaped how educated people understood the origins of their sacred texts. Then came George Smith, a young engraver at the British Museum who had taught himself to read cuneiform. And in 1872, he stood before the Society of Biblical Archaeology in London and announced that he had translated a Babylonian account of a great flood, a deluge sent by the gods to destroy humanity, a story in which one righteous man was warned to build a boat and save his family and the animals of the earth, a story that predated the biblical account of Noah by more than 1,000 years. The announcement made front-page news across Europe and America, and the Daily Telegraph newspaper was so eager for more that they funded an expedition to Nineveh, where Smith himself would search for the missing portions of the tablet. And remarkably, he found them, adding to the growing body of evidence that the stories of Genesis might not have been original after all. This discovery triggered what we might call the Victorian crisis of faith, a profound disorientation that rippled through churches and universities and parlor rooms across the Western world. For if the flood story existed in Babylon before it appeared in the Bible, what did this mean for divine inspiration, and what other narratives might have earthly predecessors hidden in the clay tablets still being unearthed from the sands of Iraq? The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic that tells of the god Marduk fashioning the heavens and earth from the body of the slain chaos dragon Tiamat, would soon be recognized as bearing striking similarities to the opening chapter of Genesis. And scholars began to ask uncomfortable questions about the relationship between these ancient Mesopotamian texts and the sacred scriptures of Judaism and Christianity. Religious institutions responded to these discoveries in varied ways, with some embracing the archaeological finds as confirmation of biblical history, pointing to the flood narrative as evidence that a great deluge had indeed occurred and was remembered by multiple ancient cultures, while others saw the discoveries as deeply threatening to the uniqueness of divine revelation, raising the specter that the Bible might be merely one voice among many in an ancient chorus of myth and legend. This tension between scholarship and faith, between the excitement of discovery and the anxiety of implication, persists to this very day, shaping how religious communities engage with ancient history and how academic institutions approach the study of sacred texts. The Catholic Church, for its part, chose a path of engagement rather than retreat, and in 1909, Pope Pius X established the Pontifical Biblical Institute as a center for specialized studies of sacred scripture and related sciences. Entrusting it to the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, who had long been known for their intellectual rigor and scholarly achievement. This institute, known also as the Biblicum, houses the biblical faculty which awards academic degrees in sacred scripture. And significantly, it also houses the faculty of ancient Near Eastern studies, which awards degrees in ancient Oriental languages. A clear signal that the Church was not hiding from the discoveries emerging from Mesopotamian soil, but rather training scholars to engage with them at the highest level. The Church chose engagement over rejection, and yet questions remain about what lies in the depths of collections acquired over centuries. And so, let us consider what theological sensitivities might be at stake when we examine the parallels between Sumerian and biblical texts. The significance of being first in matters of religious narrative cannot be overstated. For if the stories of Genesis were adapted from earlier Mesopotamian sources, this raises profound questions about the nature of divine revelation and the uniqueness of the biblical witness, and different theological frameworks have emerged to help believers make sense of these parallels. Now, some scholars suggest that if the writers of Genesis did know the Enuma Elish, we must ask whether they were simply adapting the poem to tell their own stories of creation, or if they purposefully reworked the Babylonian epic to claim supremacy for the God of Israel instead of Marduk. And this question of intentional polemic versus unconscious borrowing has occupied theologians for more than a century. Conrad Hyers of the Princeton Theological Seminary suggests that Genesis, rather than merely adopting earlier Babylonian and other creation myths, polemically addressed them to repudiate the divinization of nature and the attendant myths of divine origins, divine conflict, and divine ascent, meaning that the biblical authors may have known these stories and deliberately crafted their own narrative as a theological response. And indeed, the differences between the Sumerian and biblical accounts are as striking as their similarities. For the Mesopotamian versions are polytheistic, with multiple gods involved in the creation process and violent battles among divine beings, while the biblical version emphasizes the monotheistic belief in a single God who creates through the power of divine speech alone. There is nothing comparable in the biblical version of creation because the Hebrew God has no one to fight, no primordial chaos dragon to slay and dismember, no council of frightened deities pleading for a champion, and instead, God produces heaven and earth through sovereign command, the universe complacently conforming to divine will in a manner appropriate to monotheistic theology. Many scholars today, including religious ones, have come to accept the likelihood of cultural influence without abandoning their belief in divine inspiration, embracing the idea that God might speak through existing cultural forms, using the language and imagery familiar to ancient peoples to communicate eternal truths. This mature theological view distinguishes between historical questions about textual origins and theological claims about meaning and truth, recognizing that a story can be profound and revelatory even if it shares elements with earlier narratives, just as a symphony can be original and beautiful even when it incorporates familiar musical themes. And when we consider whether the Vatican or any religious institution might be suppressing ancient texts that challenge biblical primacy, we must acknowledge that the parallels between Mesopotamian and biblical literature are already well known and widely published, taught in seminaries and universities around the world, discussed openly in academic journals and popular books, with no serious effort at concealment by any major religious body. The Church has actively participated in Near Eastern scholarship for more than a century through institutions like the Pontifical Biblical Institute, training scholars in Akkadian and Sumerian, contributing to the translation and publication of ancient texts, and there is no credible evidence of suppression of known texts that might prove embarrassing to traditional beliefs. Yet mysteries persist, not because institutions conspire to hide truth, but because the past itself is vast and fragmentary and only partially recovered. And we must consider what remains to be discovered in the countless tablets that still await translation. Even the most famous texts have gaps in our knowledge, for most of Tablet 5 of the Enuma Elish has never been recovered, leaving a lacuna in our understanding of this foundational creation myth. And if such gaps exist in texts that have been studied for more than a century, imagine what unknowns lurk in the tablets that have never been read at all. Countless tablets remain unstudied in museum storage rooms around the world, and the possibility of entirely new texts emerging from ongoing excavations keeps the field of Assyriology vibrant with anticipation. For any dig season might produce a tablet that rewrites our understanding of ancient history. We humans are drawn to the idea of suppressed truths and hidden knowledge, and a psychological tendency that helps explain the enduring appeal of conspiracy theories about ancient texts and religious cover-ups. And there is a legitimate frustration with institutional opacity that feeds these suspicions even when no actual conspiracy exists. The real mysteries of ancient Mesopotamia are fascinating enough without invented conspiracies. For the questions that genuinely perplex scholars are themselves profound and unresolved, including the fundamental puzzle of whether the Sumerian civilization really existed as a distinct ethnic group, whether they were immigrants to southern Mesopotamia, and why their language is so utterly unique, with no known relatives among the language families of the world. The origin of the Sumerians remains genuinely mysterious, and the mechanisms by which ideas traveled between cultures in the ancient world are still imperfectly understood, leaving room for legitimate speculation about how flood stories and creation myths might have spread across the Near East. And beyond the great literary texts, there are the voices of ordinary people lost to time, the merchants and farmers and mothers whose concerns were too mundane to preserve, whose tablets, if they ever existed, have crumbled to dust or lie unread in museum basements. And perhaps these everyday voices would teach us more about ancient life than all the epic poems combined. Perhaps the mystery itself is more important than any answer we might find. For the human search for meaning that drove ancient Sumerians to press their thoughts into wet clay is the same impulse that drives us today to seek understanding across the vast distance of millennia. And in this shared longing, we discover our kinship with those long-dead scribes. The clay tablets are testimony to our shared humanity, evidence that people 5,000 years ago wondered about the same questions that trouble us still. Questions about where we came from and why we are here, and what happens when we die, and whether anyone is listening when we cry out to the heavens. As we near the end of our journey through the theological implications of these ancient parallels, let us zoom out and consider the broader landscape of ancient texts and the ongoing effort to hear voices that have been silenced for millennia, voices that perhaps have more to teach us about ourselves than we yet realize. And now we must step back from the quiet vaults of the Vatican and see the larger picture that surrounds us. for the tablets held within those Roman walls are but a tiny fraction of a vast ocean of clay and wedge marks that stretches across the museums and storerooms of our entire world. And the truth of this matter is both humbling and filled with a strange and gentle hope that rises like morning mist over ancient marshlands. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of what remains unread and unknown. For scholars estimate that somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million cuneiform tablets have been pulled from the earth by archaeologists over the past 2 centuries. And yet, of this extraordinary number, only a small percentage have ever been translated or published or studied with the care they deserve. The British Museum in London holds within its collections approximately 130,000 tablets, making it the largest repository of cuneiform writing anywhere on Earth. And yet, even with all the resources of that great institution, most of these tablets have sat in storage for a century or more without ever feeling the careful attention of a trained eye. The Louvre in Paris holds its own magnificent collection, as does the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, and the Istanbul Archaeology Museums and the Yale Babylonian Collection with its 40,000 tablets, and the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, and countless other institutions scattered across Europe and America and the Middle East. Every major museum that participated in the great archaeological expeditions of the 19th and 20th centuries came home with boxes and crates filled with inscribed clay, and many of those boxes have never been fully opened or catalogued or understood. This is not a conspiracy of silence or a deliberate hiding of forbidden knowledge, but rather the simple, overwhelming reality of a scholarly field that has always had too much material and too few trained hands to examine it all. The cuneiform writing system is notoriously difficult to master, for it evolved over 3,000 years and was used to write more than a dozen different languages. And the wedge-shaped marks can be read in multiple ways depending on context and period and regional variation. To become a true expert in reading these ancient texts requires years of dedicated study, learning not only the physical shapes of the signs, but also the grammar and vocabulary of dead languages that have no living speakers. And even after all that training, a scholar might specialize in only one period or one type of text, or one of the many languages that borrowed the cuneiform system from its Sumerian origins. There are perhaps only a few hundred people alive today who possess the skills necessary to read cuneiform tablets with confidence, and that small community of scholars cannot possibly work through the hundreds of thousands of texts that await their attention. And so, the tablets wait, patient and silent in their climate-controlled storage rooms, holding within their clay bodies the voices of people who lived and loved and worried and celebrated 5,000 years ago. What stories do they contain, these untranslated tablets that fill the archives of the world? Most of them, if we are being honest, are probably rather ordinary by the standards of ancient record-keeping. For the vast majority of cuneiform texts that have been translated turn out to be administrative documents and economic records and legal contracts and school exercises, and all the mundane paperwork of complex civilizations. We find receipts for shipments of barley, and records of temple offerings, and lists of workers who received their bread rations and contracts for the sale of houses and fields and slaves. We find letters from merchants complaining about the quality of copper ingots, and letters from sons asking their mothers to send more money, and letters from officials explaining why the taxes are late this year. we find the homework of young scribes learning their craft, copying out lists of signs and vocabulary words, and practicing the difficult art of pressing reed into wet clay. These everyday documents may seem disappointing to those who hope for earth-shattering revelations, and yet to historians they are precious beyond measure. For it is through such ordinary records that we can reconstruct the texture of daily life in the ancient world with an intimacy and detail that no royal inscription or mythological text could ever provide. Imagine reading a personal letter written 4,000 years ago by a woman named Zimri Atum to her absent husband, complaining about his failure to send money and reminding him of his obligations to his family. And suddenly, across the vast gulf of time, you hear a voice that sounds remarkably like voices you might hear today, filled with the same frustrations and hopes and domestic concerns that have always occupied human hearts. Imagine reading a medical text that describes symptoms and treatments for various ailments, and realizing that these ancient healers were careful observers who developed their own sophisticated understanding of the human body even without modern scientific instruments. Imagine reading an astronomical diary that records the movements of planets and the phases of the moon night after night for years on end, and understanding that these ancient sky watchers were building a systematic knowledge of the heavens that would eventually contribute to our own astronomical traditions. Every tablet contains a piece of human experience, a fragment of consciousness pressed into clay and preserved across millennia. And even the most mundane receipt or inventory list tells us something about how people organized their lives and their societies in those distant days. But there are also tablets that contain literary works and religious texts and mythological narratives. And among these unstudied collections, there may well be poems and stories that no modern person has ever read. Tales of gods and heroes that would add new chapters to our understanding of ancient imagination. Already, the tablets that have been translated have given us such treasures as the Epic of Gilgamesh, with its profound meditations on mortality and friendship, and the Enuma Elish, with its cosmic vision of creation through divine conflict, and countless hymns and prayers and wisdom texts that reveal the spiritual lives of ancient peoples. What else might be waiting in those unopened boxes? What other masterpieces of ancient literature might emerge when scholars finally have the time and resources to examine every tablet in every collection? This question brings us to one of the most hopeful developments in the modern study of ancient texts. For in recent years, researchers have begun developing artificial intelligence systems that can assist in the translation of cuneiform tablets, potentially accelerating the work of reading these ancient documents by orders of magnitude. A team of archaeologists and computer scientists from Israel has created an AI-powered translation program for Akkadian cuneiform that achieved 97% accuracy in translating cuneiform symbols to transliterated Latin script. And while this is only the first step in the translation process, it dramatically reduces the time needed to work through large collections of tablets. Other research teams around the world are developing similar tools, training machine learning systems on the thousands of tablets that have already been translated so that they can recognize patterns and suggest readings for tablets that have never been studied before. The Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative has been working for years to make high-quality images of tablets available online, creating a digital archive that scholars anywhere in the world can access without traveling to the museums where the physical tablets are stored. And this democratization of access means that the work of translation no longer depends solely on who can afford to spend months in London or Berlin or Philadelphia. Young scholars in Baghdad and Tehran and Ankara can now study the same tablets as their colleagues in Oxford and Chicago. And the international community of cuneiformists grows larger and more diverse with each passing year. Meanwhile, institutions like the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome continue training new generations of scholars in the ancient languages and scripts of the Near East, is ensuring that human expertise will complement the new digital tools rather than being replaced by them. The courses offered at such institutions include not only the ancient languages themselves, but also archaeology and geography and hermeneutics, and all the contextual knowledge necessary to understand what these texts meant to the people who wrote and read them in their own time. For even the most sophisticated AI system cannot replace the careful judgment of a trained scholar who understands the historical and cultural context of an ancient text, who can recognize when a word might have multiple meanings, or when a text might be using irony or metaphor or deliberate ambiguity. The future of cuneiform studies lies not in choosing between human expertise and machine assistance, but in bringing them together, using AI to handle the enormous scale of the problem while relying on human insight to interpret what the texts actually mean. And what might we find as this work proceeds, as more and more tablets are photographed and digitized and translated and published? Perhaps we will discover new literary masterpieces that will take their place alongside Gilgamesh and Enuma Elish in the canon of world literature. Perhaps we will find historical records that resolve long-standing debates about the chronology and events of ancient history. Perhaps we will find scientific and mathematical texts that reveal new depths of ancient intellectual achievement. And yes, perhaps we will find more texts that illuminate the origins of biblical narrative. More stories that show how the traditions of Israel emerged from and responded to the broader cultural world of the ancient Near East. Whatever we find will add to our understanding of who we are and where we came from. For the story of ancient Mesopotamia is part of our story too, part of the long human journey from the first cities to the global civilization we inhabit today. And so we arrive at a moment of hope, for the ancient voices are not silenced, but merely waiting, patient as the clay that carries them, for someone to listen and to understand and to share what they have to say with a world that has almost forgotten they ever existed. And so we arrive at the end of our journey, though perhaps it is not truly an end at all, but rather a pause in a conversation that has continued for 5,000 years and will continue long after we are gone. We cannot say with certainty what every cuneiform tablet in the Vatican's possession contains. We cannot claim to have unlocked every secret pressed into ancient clay by hands that turned to dust millennia before the first stone of St. Peter's was laid. And yet this uncertainty need not trouble us, for the mystery itself is a kind of gift, an invitation to wonder rather than a cause for anxiety or suspicion. What we do know is this: the Vatican possesses artifacts from the ancient Near East, clay tablets inscribed with the wedge-shaped script that humanity first used to capture thought and memory and story. Some of these tablets came from the collection of the Pontifical Biblical Institute, an institution founded over a century ago to engage seriously with the ancient world and its texts, and the scholars who work within those walls have contributed to our understanding of Sumerian and Akkadian and Babylonian civilization, alongside their colleagues in museums and universities around the globe. We know too that the Vatican is not alone in possessing untranslated tablets. For hundreds of thousands of these ancient documents rest in climate-controlled rooms, from London to Baghdad to New Haven, waiting patiently as they have waited for centuries, their words suspended in silence until someone with the skill and time and funding arrives to give them voice again. And perhaps this is the most profound truth we can take from our journey tonight, that 5,000 years ago, in the marshlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, a scribe whose name we will never know pressed a reed stylus into soft, wet clay and left an impression that would outlast empires and religions and languages and entire ways of being human. And tonight, in whatever room you find yourself, in whatever country, in whatever state of wakefulness or drowsiness, you have listened to echoes of that ancient act. You have participated in the longest conversation our species has ever conducted, the conversation between past and present, between the dead and the living, between those who wondered at the stars and those who still wonder today. The chain of transmission is fragile, broken in many places, with vast silences where voices once spoke, and gaps where tablets crumbled or were lost or simply never found. And yet the chain remains unbroken across time, stretched thin but holding, connecting the first scribe to the last reader in an unbroken line of human curiosity and human need to know and human refusal to let the darkness swallow everything. You are part of this conversation now, simply by listening, simply by caring enough to spend these quiet hours contemplating questions that have no easy answers. And so, as sleep begins to gather at the edges of your awareness, as your breathing slows and your thoughts begin to soften and blur, may the weight of ages bring you peace rather than burden. May the mysteries that remain be sources of wonder rather than worry. May you dream of marshlands golden in the ancient sun and ziggurats rising toward heavens, filled with gods whose names we are only beginning to remember. May you dream of scribes bent over their work in lamplight, of caravans crossing deserts with tablets wrapped in cloth, of archaeologists brushing sand from surfaces that have not seen light for 30 centuries. And may you wake with the quiet knowledge that the past is always waiting, patient as clay, ready to speak to those who take the time to listen. Somewhere tonight, in a room you will never see, behind walls you will never pass through, a clay tablet rests in darkness, its words pressed into its surface when the pyramids were young, when Troy had not yet fallen, when the ancestors of every civilization we know were only beginning to imagine what they might become. Those words have waited thousands of years already, and they can wait a little longer. Perhaps tomorrow someone will read them for the first time and discover something that changes everything we thought we knew. Or perhaps they will simply confirm what we have always sensed in our deepest moments of reflection, that we have always been here, wondering, writing, reaching across the darkness toward understanding, that the questions we ask today are the same questions asked by those first scribes in Sumer, and that the search for meaning is the one thread that connects every human who has ever lived. The clay remembers what we forget. The tablets keep their vigil through the long night of history. And now, let your eyes close. Let your mind drift like a boat on the slow rivers of Mesopotamia. Let the ancient words become a lullaby sung in a language older than memory. Sleep now. The mysteries will still be here when morning comes. The clay will still remember. And somewhere, in the silence between heartbeats, the conversation continues. As it always has, as it always will, until the last tablet crumbles and the last star burns out. And even then, perhaps, even then, some echo will remain, pressed into the fabric of the universe itself, waiting for someone, something, to learn how to read it.